Hey everyone, Andrew here again today with Dan from RE24. Today we're on our second webinar looking at how we consider the regulatory aspects of the energy market and how they're affecting the PPA space. My name is Andrew. I am the entrepreneur in residence at Alia. I'm also an advisor across various spaces, and I've been working on the energy space with Dan, looking at how we can make our entire grid more sustainable. So Dan, quick intro from you, bud.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. Yes. Uh, Dan Tennakoon, founder and CEO of RE24. And we have been going for 2.5 years now, and it comes from 19 years in the energy sector experience, like some of the centric energy. So we are having a pretty exciting time. Done PPS in UK, in EU, and then looking at expanding outside the EU as well. Yeah, pretty exciting time, and I'm really looking forward for this discussion because I worked with you for like many years now. So there could be some curveball questions. We shall see.
Hopefully nothing too crazy, because I think my knowledge of the space doesn't compare to yours ultimately at the end of the day. But I am excited to have this conversation because I think there's a lot of things that are just not covered when you look at the energy space, right? Me coming into the sector, just the foundation side of it took me more time than I wanted it to. And so I think this space and this conversation today really be a great opportunity for those who are looking at purchasing, new energy contracts for their business, or if they're a generator looking at trying to understand some of the dynamics at play. I think this will give some of that color that admittedly I probably could have benefited from, and hopefully some of those questions will be resolved for people. And of course, if there are more questions after the webinar, we're happy to have a conversation to see what can be answered. And I'm sure Dan will be happy to spend some time talking to you about that. So with that in mind, let's dive straight in and ask some of the big questions. So, we're in a complicated world these days. Regulation, despite the fact that it is done by government, is evolving at a fairly rapid clip across the globe. We're looking at a lot of changes that have come into effect and affected, I guess, the decision makers when it comes to making an energy decision. So, Dan, could you share with us, I guess, your first thoughts on the big regulatory shifts that have occurred and how that's affecting the PPA market? And a quick reminder, PPA, power purchase agreement. So how are regulations affecting the PPA market right now? And share some color for across the geographies.
Yes. Regulations are a primary part in the PPA delivery. It's really important because these agreements are longer, 10 years or so agreements. So it's really important to get the regulations in place, all in place, so we can tackle them correctly. And then, so so maybe like if you look at market by market, so if you look at the UK market first, so there are some proper hardcore regulations comes in play, but there are some subsidies comes into play as well, which is go hand in hand. From the regulation wise, we have things like REMA, so reforms of electricity market arrangements coming in the UK, and then things like there are a bit of a debate about how this pricing would work, how the market pricing would work, nodal prices, and then the zonal prices extra. There are like loads of details goes in there. And also, if you look at the UK or EU, there has been things like windfall tax, and those came 2 years ago, 18 months ago, when with the Ukraine war, when we have high energy prices, government wants to bring that energy price under control. So they brought things like the energy wholesale market price cap for the generators, and so then that came as an extra taxation both in the EU and UK. So windfall tax in the UK, and then they directly affect the PPA prices. So we see this whole raft of different things comes into play, and when we work with generators and corporates in UK, in EU, and they have been like case by case, they all have been taken into the PPAs. Sorry, I mean, like I'm a bit actually rambled there, but essentially what we're saying is that there are clauses like change in law, um, change in law clauses goes there to cover them, and then market price cap goes in there. But a platform like RB24, the benefit is that we seen these projects across all the geographies, and then we seen with number of generators with a lot of customers. So we have all the best practices gone from them and then
Mm-hmm.
drawn into our standard terms and conditions.
Mm.
Yeah. So it's almost like you need your lawyers, you need your team, but at the same time, we can give that fantastic platform, the starting point, where you won't miss anything because it's a
Nice.
very competitive space.
Yeah, I mean, constantly evolving, constantly evolving. So, considering all the changes that are occurring in the market, could you share with us what your thoughts are about some of the big regulations that are impacting PPAs and how that is really, I guess, making a big splash in the space? So, your thoughts across geographies.
Yes, and the regulation has changed based on the geographies that we operate. So, for example, in the UK market, CFDs is a main component. So that's contract for difference. That's the subsidy scheme goes for renewable energy projects, and then currently UK is in a new CFD round. And so they not just affect the pricing of the renewable projects, but also affects the indexation, affects the terms, and then how they come into place. But then there are things like the non-subsidy regulated implications comes in the UK, things like the windfall tax and the market revenue cap. So these are the government regulation, extra taxation brought in to bring the wholesale energy market price under control. And then so that's kind of UK example. But then similarly, if you look at the European market, so there are energy efficiency directive in the European market, and those the Green Deal in the European market. So again, those things comes into play. And then if you look at across the pond and in the US, so we have the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act heavily affecting the end energy users. So there's a tax benefit that they have. But again, those ones comes into play in the PPA structuring, PPA pricing, and the contract details. Yeah, so it's very location specific. Yeah, it's almost like as if you're watching the kind of BBC program on location. So regulation is all about location.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And it's interesting to see all the different approaches that governments are taking, right? Because obviously with things like, as you mentioned, the windfall tax, it's a very different approach than the IRA or the Green New Deal, right? So in these or the Green Deal, excuse me, you're seeing a lot of variation in approach. And so having that connection across the space is obviously, it's quite a big task. So when you're thinking about like the size and scope of that, like maybe what are some of the risks associated with this, right? Because all of them are doing different things. In your mind, what's the biggest risk for people to be aware of as a generator or as a buyer when you're thinking about these regulations that are coming into effect?
Yeah, I'm not trying to scare off anyone here in this call, but these are long-term contracts, and you need to have a sound agreement throughout the term, so you're not exposed to exceptional risk. So one of the key things in the regulation risk is that so there could be new regulations comes in, or the change in the existing regulation, and then that can have a significant impact of how it's been priced, and then how it can be delivered, and then what are the complications in its delivery. So it's when you structure PPA, we need to see what are the current regulation that's out there, and then we need to have the agreements structured in a way that it addresses the current regulation, but also it needs to be ready for the future regulation as well. So just for an example, we have currently in the UK there's been windfall tax, and then we have similar in the US as well. So any agreement need to have that market revenue cap or windfall tax comes into play. And also in the UK, there's reforms of electricity market regulation in the discussion REMA. So the REMA, there's discussion on zonal pricing and nodal pricing versus etc. So again, when we do our PPA, those prices can come into effect. So we need to have provisions in the agreement to cater those future changes.
Mm. So
Should I?
essentially, you're looking
Yeah,
to head off the risk before the laws come into effect and make sure that you have provisions in place to protect against any surprises that may come. Because obviously, we can't predict 8 years from now, we can't predict 5 years from now, let alone 10. Um, so being prepared in the PPA agreement itself is the key risk mitigator you're thinking about when you were saying, okay, this is how we get a deal that works for all parties.
100%. Yeah, yeah. And then there are standard places in the agreement that we deal with these things. For
Mm,
example, changing law provisions, and then any of those things, how parties would engage and solve this change in law provisions, and then the regulation changes, etc. So
mhm,
there are key places in an agreement how we deal them.
mhm. Yeah, gotcha. Very good. That makes a lot of sense. So then when you're thinking, I guess, about, some of the other effects that are taking place in the market, right? We've touched a little bit about, both on subsidies as well as the taxes that are in play. Could you share a little bit about, I guess, maybe some of the carbon pricing effects that are occurring right now? Does carbon pricing affect the energy space? I mean, are we looking at people changing anything as a relationship to that? Or, I guess actually let's just start there because I have another question that's going to come on subsidies. So
All
just
right. Yeah,
framing
yeah,
the
yeah,
context now.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting, interesting. So the carbon prices directly affects the wholesale electricity market price, because the whole electricity wholesale market price is largely gas price driven.
Mm,
Yes, and then as part of that, you have the carbon taxation goes in that as well. So whether it's in the UK, EU, across various geographies, whenever the carbon price is higher, so then the wholesale electricity market price is higher. So then so the carbon price doesn't directly impact the PPA price, but at the same time, PPA price mirrors or tracks goes along the same lines with the wholesale market price. So in a way, when the wholesale market price is lower, and then the PPA prices are lower, wholesale market prices higher, PPA prices tend to be high as well. So
mm,
in that sense, yes, carbon price, it does have an impact on the
gotcha.
PPA prices. Yeah,
Very good.
but it's interesting, right? But it's almost like nobody's kind of like very keenly watching the carbon prices as such.
Mm,
But everybody keeps an eye on the wholesale market prices. But the carbon price is one of the key things which affects the wholesale market price.
okay. So essentially, obviously, it is a contributing factor, but it's not the factor that people are looking at first, right? They're looking at the wholesale market and then the effects that come from the carbon pricing. Gotcha. And so then maybe on the flip side, right, when we think about the pricing of carbon, obviously that calls into question the question of subsidies, where subsidies could affect, the underlying basis of what the market looks like. So talk to us about your thinking into the EU market and the US market, where the subsidy game is evolving, and maybe some of the incentives that are in place at the moment.
Absolutely. Again, subsidies play a key role in determining the PPA prices. Yeah, again, like geography by geography example, for example. So if you look at the UK, so we have the CFD prices in the UK, and we can see what the CFD price is done, what's the like baseline price point, and also how the indexation goes as well against the project start date. So then when you look at any renewable projects in the market, which it's in the same start date, we always see actually the PPA price is bit around the same price, or even sometimes a bit higher than the CFD price. Because
Mm,
why it's bit higher than the CF price is that because ultimately subsidies, so that's like who's underwriting that subsidies is essentially the government underwrites a subsidy, and then compared to any most corporate, I can't say any, but compared to most corporate creditworthiness, the government creditworthiness is actually considers better, and also they have a lot more recognition as well. So in a way, if you are a corporate looking for a PPA, so then we see actually the PPA prices are higher than the CFD prices. So
mm,
that's from one side. But on the other side, there are some projects which preliminary goes into the subsidy schemes, but they can come out of the subsidy scheme before it comes to certain levels. So when
Okay.
corporates are looking for PPAs, so that's one of the options for the corporates as well, whether they can tap into some of those projects, and it's an option for the generator to stay in the subsidy scheme or to come out of the subsidy scheme. But again, naturally, they will come out from the subsidy scheme for higher
Higher rates.
returns, higher
Yeah.
rates. So then
So,
it's
in other words, then, so the generators that go into the CFD regime in the UK, for instance, like, they're benefiting from the subsidies and they're there. But what you're ultimately saying is that despite the fact that there's another CFD round going on, there is interest potentially from the generators to look at capturing some of those return differentials by working with the corporates, typically because, admittedly, the credit worthiness of the government, although it's much higher, still can yield better returns for the generators themselves to look at the corporate market.
yeah, exactly. And then
Hmm.
and that's exactly the same in the other markets as well. For example,
Yeah.
we've seen the Irish market. For example, in Ireland, we recently had RES 4 auction results. So the RES 4 for the combined renewable projects. But again, you have a baseline price point for the successful project for wind projects and the successful price point for solar projects. And then any projects that we see coming into the market for PPAs, it's actually going along those subsidy such in those subsidy prices.
Mm,
And sometimes we see when the subsidies go way too low, actually the generators are able to capture a bit more higher price
mm,
from the PPAs,
mm, mm,
which gives an added benefit for the generator, but also from the taxpayer as well. That's actually good value for
mm.
the taxpayer too, because in a way, taxpayer doesn't have to subsidize it.
I'm a fan.
Yeah, exactly.
So then, when
Yeah,
I'm thinking about, I guess, these subsidy schemes that are working towards trying to drive greater adoption, greater, I guess, the greater deployment of renewable generation and projects. I think one of the things that's come out of the IRA has been the expansion of more tax credits, like the ITC and the production tax credit. And the ITC is the investment tax credit, which is trying to help make PPAs more viable. And I think this is the general theme that we're seeing across, at least across these three major markets, the UK, EU, and the US, is that there is a lot of effort going into subsidizing the PPA mechanic in order to ensure that corporations are making their appropriate steps into that renewable journey, as well as, obviously, we want to make sure that our companies are not sourcing from fake green energy, like purchasing a power purchase agreement, but then not actually making sure that it's coming from a clean source, and rather just blending it with other
yeah,
people. So I think this makes a lot of sense
yeah, exactly.
for the future. Let's see how it keeps playing out.
It's
Mm.
a very,
So,
very, very exciting space.
so with companies then in the market looking at regulation, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was the windfall tax. Like, talk to me about how you think companies should be, I guess, adapting to these things, how they should be being prepared for it, right? Everybody's got lawyers, but you know
Yeah,
what
yeah.
what should they do differently?
No, it's actually interesting. So it's not just the energy space. And just as an example, right? Before COVID came into place, none of the contracts, all the contracts had force majeure events, like act of God event in those contracts. So if there's a flood, the project can't go ahead. So it's an excuse.
Mm,
And then none of them had things like COVID in there because people haven't seen them before. But
yeah.
then since COVID, kind of pandemic has been one of the key elements goes in that force majeure event,
Mm,
act of God event. So in a way, the pandemic wouldn't impact if the pandemics wouldn't cause the contract to go in breach. So
mhm,
similarly, we've seen the kind of new things like the windfall tax comes into play as well. There are some people who are lot up to speed, and then like higher up in the game as such. There are some which are just catching up, and then we see across the board again in the UK and Europe, we see different terms from different legal teams, different companies, different generators, and we have been in a really unique position actually. It's almost like if you are a customer, you have your lawyer, and then you get the view from your from your lawyer, and then we see like tens and twenties of those legal points, and those clauses. So we are in a unique place. We can see what's good, what's bad, what's ugly, what doesn't work, what perfectly works. So that's one of the amazing benefits. Actually, we can, or we not we can we bring it to our clients, because through all those lessons learned, so we have the kind of best workable clauses, provisions available in the contract, and we make it out there available for our customers. So the objective is like for the customer to say, no, 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 you don't need your lawyers. Objective is not that. No, obviously you like you have your trusted legal teams, you have the support, but actually ours is a very good starting point, and a very good, almost like the well-established market position. You can get the lessons learned from that, and you can keep your cost to a minimum as well.
Because effectively, what, as I understand it, right, you're saying that the situation for a client working with RE24 is that they have the unique advantage of being able to tap into the fact that RE24 is the convener, right? They are working across all the different deals across different geographies. We can almost see, I guess, the opportunity then of like, I guess the almost the law of large numbers, that when you start seeing lots of deals and how they work, you get to see what's working for both the generator and for the buyer, so that ultimately, there is less of the back and forth faff behind
Absolutely, yes.
finding ideal terms, because what you're seeing is standardized terms across markets, right? It's no
Yeah.
longer, I guess the ridiculousness of having to tailor an agreement working directly with the generator, but rather you're seeing some standardized terms and some, I guess, unification across, given the nuance of a market, unification across these spaces to work best for all parties.
Yeah, yeah. And one other thing is that they have been tried and tested. So we put those contracts into place. They have been in operational, and then we have some lessons learned from that, and reflected them as well. So it's so they're tried and tested things for those regulatory changes.
That's cool. Very cool. Well, let's leave a little bit of the specifics of regulation behind a little bit. Let's look towards other technicalities in the space, because regulation not only affects obviously the contracts, but also affects some of the macro factors such as grid integrations, right? Where people need to get something locked in and actually connected into the space, as opposed to just saying, oh yeah, we built a project, but if it's not connected, what good is that? So talk to us. How are you seeing trends in grid integration? Are there things happening right now that are affecting that are slowing down deals or accelerating deals? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's not that I'm saying like all your questions are exciting, but these are genuinely very, very exciting spaces.
I'm an energy whiz.
No, but yeah. So yeah, UK grid is congested. Most of the EU grid is congested, and then as a consequence, what we see is that some of the renewable energy projects grid connection is getting delayed.
Okay.
So that's more like a local issue. So maybe what I'll try to do that, I'll try to go into that local context and see how those things change the local context, and then go into how this change in the more like international context. Yeah. So because of this grid delays, we worked on a number of projects, and we have seen number of projects where the grid connection is few years ahead, but then project is ready to deliver power. It's all out there, and so what in those instances, what we can do commercially and contractually is that we can provide power from that project to a local demand. So I to a what we call is a private wire agreement. So again, those things are like contractual and structure is actually quite fascinating, because part of the contract is dealing with the initial private wire arrangements, and then part of the contract is dealing with once you have the grid connection, how the export power would go, i.e. when the plant is operating at full capacity, how that export power would go into the market. But also the same example, we worked on a number of examples, it kind of works on the other way around as well. So the other way around is that they have the grid connection, but then also to do the private wire. So there's a fantastic factory very close to them, they can provide that. but to provide the factory, you need again the grid approval for that one. But then the grid says, okay, so we have 4 years to get that across to you. So then contractually we need to work in a way that the kind of first 4 years we get that power as a like a sleeved PPA, and then afterwards we structure that as a private wire PPA. Yeah, so the grid integration plays a very, very dynamic, interesting role. So then more. Oh, you're on mute.
Muted myself.
Yeah,
Theoretically, then, even if you didn't have a grid integration, you could look towards those who may already have one, but are not necessarily utilizing it just yet. And therefore, you'll be in a situation where you can then, go towards, using theirs via sleeve, is what you're suggesting.
100% exactly. And yeah,
Nice.
so maybe those opportunities were a bit rare back in the days, but now it's more and more common, and we can see people actively doing it. We take part in a lot of contracts in that in that nature. So very quickly to touch on the international space. So again, you have a demand in France, and the French projects need some renewable projects, but sometimes they prefer, yeah. So the French demand need the French green electrons, but at the same time, the whole EU is in that single electricity market. So then they can be provided from the project from Germany, projects from Italy, etc. So the grid in integration facilitates cross-border PPAs. So
Okay.
then we can actually facilitate a lot of projects across various geographies. For example, like you could have a demand customer, you can have demand in Italy, but that demand can be fed through renewable generation in Scandinavia, for example.
Mm.
So that's all that grid integration in a much larger scale through that single electricity market.
Nice. Okay, cool. So it allows for a lot of creativity and flexibility. It's just being able to identify the generator or the resource that you can use. And that's also, as I understand it, one of the benefits of your marketplace is that you can look across quite easily without necessarily being able to like being locked into the Italian geography, for instance.
Yes. So
Mm.
so yes. So one is that actually kind of like initial opportunity exploration, like early stage of sourcing, but then you need to work on the kind of delivery and the management of that as well. But
Mhm.
again, that's one of the unique advantages that we have, because we worked with number of opportunities in that cross-border arrangement. So we can
Mm.
clearly we have clearly work on how it can be structured from different geography to come into different geography.
Nice.
And then just to make it a little bit more, how to say, put another abbreviation in the equation. So for example, you have Poland, so part of EU, but then Poland isn't a AIB country, so Association of Issuing Bodies. So then how the Polish green credentials can be recognized in Germany, for example, how they can be used for France, etc. So those things again needs to be dealt appropriately, so we can get not just energy but that green credentials from those projects as well.
Mm-mm. Well, I think this naturally leads me on to I guess my final request for your thoughts on, which is essentially, how are people supposed to be working across all these different sets of information? Because ultimately, it sounds like I need like 15 lawyers to be able to work across the Polish law, work across Italian law, make sure I understand what's going on in the UK and the US. I know obviously RE24 is not a law firm, but what would you recommend as the way or the best practice for staying ahead of the shifting regulatory curve, of the nature of the complexities of a specific geography? What would you suggest to people who are trying to navigate this over the next 10 years?
What hang on, so if I understood the question correctly, so what the people are trying to navigate through the next 10 years, or
Yeah,
actually
so
the
like,
next
for the next 10 years, people are going to be looking at how they're going to adapt to it. How can they be prepared? What's the best practice for them? What
Yeah.
advice would you
Yes,
give to people
yes,
looking for
yes.
best practice over the next 10
Yeah.
years?
Yeah, exactly. So it's almost like it's actually best practice, and is currently what we are doing for our customers as well. So like what we actively work on. So one approach is that if you put a lot of time and resources into like geography by geography, so then you can master on those geographies and then do the contract by contract. But it takes a lot of time and effort, and also significant amount of learning, and then it's a regulated landscape across all the geographies, so it's complicated. But then what we do with our customers is that we simply bring in all the lessons learned from each and every geography, that and then from our projects, from our operation projects, we bring them into place, and in terms of like standard contracts, standard provisions. So obviously the parties negotiate all the key commercial things, the generator and then buyer and the seller, they negotiate the key commercial things in there. But they have a very solid baseline in terms of how they do the regulation, how they can ship energy, how they can manage the guarantees of origin, how they can meet the compliance, and then so on. So in a way, kind of best practice, I would say, is that it's almost like we touched that upon earlier as well. So like you need your like trusted like lawyers, obviously from your end, the people you have been worked with many years. But at the same time, a platform like us, the benefit that we bring is that we actually make it significantly more easier for everybody to deal with, because we have the lessons learned and then the standard contracts or terms across all those geographies.
And the other component of it, not even just from a sourcing standpoint, we're seeing a lot of regulation now that comes out and asks for the next level of verification, transparency, and authenticity, right? They're looking for real-time data. They're looking for, regos. They're looking for hourly certifications. We're looking at all these different evolutions of data. Is that a component that you feel like is something that is easily tied in here, or is that just a completely different regulatory space?
No, that's, I mean, easily tied in sense. The contracts regulations, you just put in the paper, and then people put the contract in the drawer, and then forget about it until something happens. When something happens, then all of a sudden, like Mayday scenario, right? But then but then what we see is that with our customers and with their end consumers as well, that real-time data visibility, that granular information, it actually makes a significant impact to them. And you can, like it's hard to imagine. You can see the, what's the word term for that? You can see the glare of their
Yeah, the
of your,
twinkling in their eye when they got them open.
exactly right, glare in your eyes. But you should see the customer's eyes when they see, okay, this is their consumption, this is the renewable energy that they're using, and then this is what they're doing in real time. They're actually really, really passionate about it, and then seeing that it makes it's actually a big thing for them. Yeah. So yes, so it's not just the contracts and the regulation important, but having that visibility, that transparency, that authenticity of that power. And it's almost, we do the right thing, but also it's really good for people to see and feel that they're doing the right thing as well. And the transparency is the one that enables that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the regulatory space evolves, because they haven't put as many teeth into the regulations yet, but they have the opportunity to do so, right? They have the opportunity to start drawing on those fines and to start penalizing people for not actually demonstrating their I guess the veracity behind their renewable claims. So this next stage, I think, as the regulations settle, we're going to see more people looking at, are you actually being sustainable? And if you're not, are there consequences behind it? So I take your point very much so on that data, and that'll be very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And also most of our customers see, what they see is that if they take one step ahead now, and it's not just they get the satisfaction, not just they actually meet their CSR, their sustainability criteria, they can shout the word about it. but also from a regulation wise, they're actually one step ahead on in meeting that compliance, going one step above.
Got it. Very good. Well, I think that's all the time that we have for today. Thanks for your time, Dan, and looking forward to our next conversation because we have another one coming up to discuss more about the challenges in the space. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you for listening, and Dan, thank you for your time, bud.
Thank you.
Chat later. Bye.